Senator, go ahead.
Look, if they really cared about drug traffickers, the president wouldn't be pardoning drug traffickers. They would be putting money towards law enforcement. So let's go after the drug traffickers, but let's not be committing international war crimes and.
Watch what just happened, and watch what this exposes about the rotting core of Republican politics in America. Because what Senator Tammy Duckworth just laid bare in those 30 seconds is nothing less than the complete moral bankruptcy of a party that has spent decades weaponizing the language of law and order while constructing an entire edifice of power designed to protect the actual criminals at the very top of the global narcotics trade. And you need to understand that this isn't just another political dust-up where both sides have a point and reasonable people can disagree, because what we're witnessing right now in real time, as these revelations cascade across our media landscape, is a shattering indictment of Trumpism itself, as an ideology that has never been about protecting Americans from drug cartels, but has always been about using state violence as theater, while the real traffickers get presidential pardons and private audiences at Mar-a-Lago. Former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was convicted in 2024 of trafficking drugs into the United States, has been freed from prison after he was granted a pardon by President Donald Trump, and this pardon came just days ago while simultaneously since September, U.S. military strikes on at least 21 Venezuelan boats in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific have killed more than 80 people, and think about the stunning moral grotesquerie of this juxtaposition, where Trump is literally pardoning a man who was accused by U.S. federal prosecutors of taking bribes from drug cartels and helping them smuggle an estimated 400 tons of cocaine from Honduras to the United States, while ordering what amount to summary executions of people on boats in international waters without trial, without evidence, without any semblance of due process whatsoever. And I want you to hold these two realities in your mind simultaneously, because the cognitive dissonance is the point. The breathtaking hypocrisy becomes even more obscene when you realize that during his trial, a federal prosecutor alleged Hernandez once boasted at a meeting with narco-traffickers that together they were going to shove the drugs right up the noses of the gringos, and Judge Kevin Castell, who presided over the case, described Hernandez as a two-faced politician hungry for power, while former Attorney General Merrick Garland stated that Hernandez abused his presidency to operate the country as a narco-state, where violent traffickers operated with near-total impunity, and yet Trump issued a pardon anyway because that's what fascism looks like when it wears the mask of law enforcement. Because fascism has never been about rules applied equally, but about who gets protected and who gets punished. And what Trump has created is a two-tiered system where powerful foreign narco-presidents who pay the right lobbyists and cultivate the right connections get freedom while poor Venezuelan fishermen get blown to pieces by American missiles, in what Tammy Duckworth said the Trump administration committed a war crime over the report of its double-tap order to kill survivors of an alleged drug-carrying vessel. And here's where it gets absolutely chilling, because Trump has pardoned more than 20 people serving time for serious drug crimes, some involving violence, even while Trump promised to attack drug gangs and called for the death penalty for street dealers. So the pattern is unmistakable, where Trump wants death for low-level street dealers, who are typically poor people of color in American cities, while granting clemency to actual cartel-connected kingpins, and this tracks perfectly with the authoritarian playbook throughout history, where violence gets deployed downward against the powerless, while mercy flows upward to the connected, because most of Trump's pardons and commutations were granted to people with personal or political connections to him, and convicted Trump advisor Roger Stone has been urging Trump to pardon Hernandez for months, and Secretary of State Marco Rubio has long sung Hernandez's praises, and suddenly the whole corrupt architecture becomes visible, where pardons aren't about justice or mercy, but about rewarding friends and signaling to current and future allies that loyalty to Trump supersedes all other considerations, including facilitating the poisoning of Americans. What Duckworth articulated so powerfully is that if Trump actually cared about stopping drug traffickers, he wouldn't be pardoning the biggest ones in the Western Hemisphere. But what makes this even more devastating is that Trump isn't just pardoning garden-variety drug criminals. Juan Orlando Hernandez, who U.S. officials said was at the center of one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world. According to court documents, Hernandez abused his position to facilitate importation of tons of cocaine into the United States, and in exchange, he received millions of dollars in drug money from some of the largest and most violent drug trafficking organizations in the hemisphere. So we're not talking about someone who got caught with drugs. We're talking about state-level narco-corruption at its absolute apex, and Trump looked at that conviction handed down by American prosecutors under American law after a jury trial and said, "Congratulations, you're free." Meanwhile, as Trump pardons actual narco-state presidents, his administration is conducting what a group of former military lawyers outlined as orders to kill everybody and to double-tap a target in order to kill survivors, which are clearly illegal under international law. And in short, they are war crimes, and former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta called the second strike a war crime, stating that the basic rules of war make very clear that you do not strike wounded people in the water in order to kill them, and you basically then are responsible to try to make sure you do everything to try to protect their lives at that point. And what we're witnessing is the complete abandonment of the laws of war in service of what amounts to political theater, because the Trump administration claims these boats were trafficking drugs to the U.S., but has not backed these allegations with any evidence, so we're just supposed to trust that the people being executed without trial in international waters definitely deserved it, while the guy who bragged about shoving cocaine up Americans' noses gets a presidential pardon. The intellectual dishonesty reaches truly Orwellian proportions when you consider that Republicans have spent the last decade screaming about border security and the fentanyl crisis and drug cartels destroying American communities, and yet when they had the chance to actually fund real law enforcement solutions, they sabotaged them because Trump's MAGA minions in Congress proposed a budget that could get rid of up to 2,000 Customs and Border Patrol agents and slash the budget of the Drug Enforcement Agency, and rejected President Biden's budget proposal, which included bolstering law enforcement with more funding and hundreds of new Border Patrol agents. So the Republican position becomes perfectly clear that they don't want to actually solve the drug crisis, they want to use it as a cudgel against immigrants and as justification for military adventurism while protecting their wealthy connected friends who are the ones actually moving the product. And this is what Duckworth meant when she said they would be putting money towards law enforcement if they really cared, because actual drug interdiction requires the boring, unglamorous work of investigation and prosecution and international cooperation, not blowing up boats, and certainly not pardoning convicted narco presidents. A coherent strategy would involve not blowing up boats, but actually boarding them, arresting those involved, collecting evidence and intelligence on the boat, and working your way through the networks that are involved in narcotics trafficking. And that's what competent drug policy looks like. But Trump doesn't want competent drug policy, because competent drug policy doesn't generate viral videos of explosions, and doesn't allow him to look tough on Fox News, and doesn't provide cover for his authoritarian impulses. And here's the thing that should terrify every American, because a second strike was ordered after 2 survivors were spotted sitting or standing on the stricken vessel, and Duckworth said it was essentially murder, stating that if a pilot bails out and he's in a rubber dinghy in the middle of the ocean, under all the international laws of warfare you are supposed to help render aid to that individual, which means American service members are being ordered to commit what legal experts across the political spectrum are calling war crimes in service of a drug war that the president himself is undermining by pardoning major traffickers. Think about the message this sends to every single person working in actual drug enforcement. Because you're a DEA agent who spent years building a case against a major trafficker, you risked your life infiltrating networks, you gathered evidence, you testified at trial, you secured a conviction, and then the president just wipes it all away with a stroke of a pen, because the trafficker hired the right lobbyist or knows the right people. And this is how authoritarian regimes operate, where law enforcement becomes entirely discretionary and gets weaponized against enemies, while friends receive protection. And what Trump has constructed is a system where drug enforcement isn't about stopping drugs, but about performing toughness for his base, while the actual mechanisms of narco-corruption continue unimpeded because they serve his interests. And we need to talk about the racial and class dimensions of this, because when Trump talks about wanting the death penalty for drug dealers, he's not talking about Juan Orlando Hernandez or Ross Ulbricht or Larry Hoover, whom prosecutors pointed out was head of perhaps the most pernicious efficient drug operation in the United States, and was convicted of state and federal charges, including murder and use of a firearm, while trafficking drugs, and his gang sold over $100 million of drugs a year in the city of Chicago alone, and was responsible for countless murders, and supported their drug territories with ruthless violence, and Trump pardoned him anyway, because that's who benefits from Trumpism, not the vulnerable populations destroyed by the drug trade, but the kingpins at the top, who understand that in Trump's America justice is for sale, and protection flows to those with connections. The boats that Trump is ordering destroyed aren't the billion-dollar operations, they're likely desperate people trying to make money in collapsed economies, while the actual architects of the drug trade, the people like Hernandez who corrupt entire governments and facilitate hundreds of tons of cocaine flowing into American communities, those people get pardons, And this is the central lie of conservative politics in America, that they're tough on crime when in reality they're only tough on certain kinds of crime committed by certain kinds of people, while white-collar crime and elite crime, and crime committed by the politically connected, receives clemency and protection. And this has been the pattern throughout American history, where poor black and brown people fill our prisons for drug offenses, while the wealthy, predominantly white people who traffic drugs at scale walk free. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that the Trump administration's campaign against alleged narco-terrorists in the Caribbean and Pacific has killed at least 80 alleged drug traffickers in recent months, and the Trump administration says the U.S. is in an armed conflict with drug cartels, but the administration has not publicly provided evidence showing an imminent threat to Americans, and some members of Congress now say that even if the U.S. were at war, launching an attack on the survivors of a strike who no longer pose a threat to the U.S. itself could constitute a war crime. So we have summary executions being carried out based on secret intelligence that we're not allowed to see, while convicted traffickers with good lawyers get presidential pardons. And if you can't see the authoritarian trajectory here, then you're not paying attention, because this is how fascist states operate, where the law becomes whatever the leader says it is, and violence gets deployed capriciously against those deemed enemies, while actual criminals receive protection. Senator Tim Kaine articulated it perfectly when he stated that Hernandez was the leader of one of the largest criminal enterprises that has ever been subject to a conviction in U.S. courts, and less than 1 year into his sentence, President Trump is pardoning him, suggesting that President Trump cares nothing about narco-trafficking. And that's the revelation here, that Trump cares nothing about narco-trafficking, except as a political weapon to be wielded against migrants and progressive governments in Latin America, while the actual traffickers who cultivate relationships with him receive clemency. And this tracks perfectly with Trump's transactional view of everything, where loyalty matters more than law, where personal relationships supersede institutional norms, where the whole architecture of justice becomes just another tool for rewarding friends and punishing enemies. The staggering scale of Hernandez's crimes cannot be overstated, because we're talking about someone who, according to U.S. Attorney Damian Williams, helped to facilitate the importation of an almost unfathomable 400 tons of cocaine to this country, which represents billions of individual doses sent to the United States with the protection and support of the former president of Honduras. And that cocaine destroyed communities, it killed Americans, it funded violence throughout Central America, and the man responsible just walked free because Trump decided to pardon him, and simultaneously Trump is ordering military strikes that kill people without trial, based on allegations that they might be trafficking drugs. So the message is clear that trafficking drugs gets you pardoned if you're connected, and gets you executed without trial if you're poor and unknown, and that's the two-tiered justice system that Trump has created. What Duckworth identified is that this isn't about drugs at all, it's about power and control, and the performance of strength for a base that has been conditioned to accept extrajudicial violence against brown people, while ignoring the corruption at the very top. The pardon creates a jarring contradiction in Trump's policy, where at the same time he was pardoning Hernandez, the Trump administration was conducting an aggressive military campaign in the Caribbean, designating cartels as foreign terrorist organizations and bombing drug boats, and that the contradiction isn't an accident, it's the point. Because authoritarian movements thrive on contradiction, because contradiction keeps people off balance and unable to formulate coherent resistance, and when nothing makes sense anymore, people stop trying to make sense of things and just accept whatever the leader says. The legal analysis here is devastating because the consensus of military law experts have said that all of this talk about the rules of engagement is an academic exercise that's besides the point, that these are civilian traffickers who are alleged criminals, but not lawful combatants, which means that even under the most generous interpretation of Trump's authority, these killings are murders, not acts of war, because you can't just declare war on civilians and start killing them. That's not how international law works. That's not how American law works. That's not how any law works outside of authoritarian regimes that have abandoned the rule of law entirely. And that's what we're witnessing here, the complete abandonment of law in service of Trumpian will, where whatever Trump wants becomes policy, regardless of legality, regardless of precedent, regardless of consequences. And here's what should terrify every single person who cares about democracy and justice, because Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth rallied to change the Department of Defense's name to the Department of War, deriding the old name as woke, and promised to kill more narco-terrorists, and simply put, Pete Hegseth is a thug and proud of it. And this is who Trump has empowered to carry out these operations. Someone who holds military law in contempt, someone who has championed war criminals, someone who views legal constraints as obstacles to be overcome, rather than as essential safeguards against atrocity. And when you put someone like that in charge of the most powerful military in human history, and give them permission to kill anyone they deem a narco-terrorist, while the president pardons actual convicted narco-state presidents, you have created the perfect conditions for state terror. What Duckworth laid bare in that clip is the complete moral bankruptcy of a political movement that has convinced millions of Americans that they're the party of law and order, while systematically dismantling every institutional safeguard against abuse of power. And this matters because the drug war has always been a mechanism of social control, deployed primarily against black and brown communities both domestically and internationally, and what we're seeing now is that function becoming more explicit, more violent, more unbound by legal constraint, while simultaneously the actual major drug traffickers who have money and connections and political influence receive clemency and protection. And if that's not a perfect encapsulation of how power operates in late-stage capitalism, then nothing is. The historical parallels are chilling, because authoritarian regimes throughout history use the specter of internal and external threats to justify extrajudicial violence, while simultaneously using that violence as cover for corruption at the highest levels, and Trump is following that playbook perfectly, where the threat of drugs justifies military operations that kill people without trial, while pardons flow to actual traffickers who have cultivated the right relationships. And the genius of this approach is that it satisfies the bloodlust of his base, who want to see brown people punished, while protecting the actual criminals who benefit from the drug trade. And this is why Trump's approval rating among Republicans remains high despite the obvious contradictions, because the cruelty is the point, and the contradictions don't matter when your political movement is based on in-group loyalty rather than consistent principles. We are watching in real time the construction of an authoritarian state apparatus that uses the language of law and order to justify lawlessness and disorder, and what makes this particularly insidious is that it's happening with the tacit support of a Republican Party that has completely abandoned any pretense of caring about actual governance or actual solutions to real problems in favor of pure power politics and culture war positioning, and the drug war is the perfect vehicle for this, because it allows them to appear tough while avoiding any accountability for failed policies, because you can always blame the other side for being soft on crime, while you're pardoning convicted narco-presidents. Senator Duckworth's moral clarity in that moment exposes everything rotten about modern Republican politics, where they weaponize state violence against the powerless, while protecting the powerful, where they talk constantly about law and order, while systematically undermining the rule of law, where they claim to care about Americans dying from drug overdoses while pardoning the people responsible for flooding America with drugs. And we need to be absolutely clear about what this represents, because this isn't policy disagreement. This isn't a difference of opinion about the best way to address the drug crisis. This is corruption. This is authoritarianism. This is the abandonment of law in service of raw power. And every American needs to understand that what's at stake here isn't just drug policy, but the fundamental question of whether we live under a system of laws or under the arbitrary will of an authoritarian president who can kill or pardon anyone he chooses based entirely on his personal whims and political calculations. The fact that Trump can pardon someone described as operating a narco-state while simultaneously ordering military strikes that kill people without trial should shock the conscience of every person regardless of political affiliation, because what this reveals is a president who views law as irrelevant and violence as a tool to be deployed or withheld based entirely on political expediency. And when you combine that with a Republican Party that has become a cult of personality willing to excuse any contradiction, any crime, any abuse of power as long as it's committed by their leader, you have the recipe for full-blown authoritarianism, and that's not hyperbole, that's just an accurate description of what we're witnessing, because when the law no longer constrains the powerful, when violence gets deployed arbitrarily against the powerless, when pardons flow to the connected while execution flows to the unknown, that is the textbook definition of authoritarian rule, and Tammy Duckworth just called it out for exactly what it is, and we all need to be paying attention, because what happens next will determine whether America remains a nation of laws or becomes a nation ruled by the whims of an authoritarian strongman who has completely captured one of our two major political parties,